For this video, I'm very glad that I'm joined by Kaytee Canfield, who has done major contributions to the report on inclusive science communication. And before I'm going to misintroduce you, do you want to say a little bit about yourself, your background, and what you're doing?
Hi, my name is Kaytee Canfield. I am a translational scientist, and I've done a lot of work with the Metcalf Institute based at the University of Rhode Island in the United States about inclusive science communication. And so my work for that is, we often refer to inclusive science communication as ISC because it's so long, such a long term. It's been around what we've called our landscape study. And this study came out of a symposium that was first held in 2018 at the University of Rhode Island. And you see a picture here from the 2019 symposium, in which we tried to bring together the community of people who have been doing work in building an equity-based approach to science communication. The landscape study was funded by the Kavli Foundation, the Burroughs Wellcome Fund, and the Metcalf Institute. And so the goal of this landscape study was to interview 30 leaders in this space about what brought them to this work, how they have approached it, where they see areas for improvement moving forward, and with whom they partner in doing this work. So I led these interviews where we interviewed 30 people that we identified alongside a group of advisors using a snowball sampling method. So the interviewees helped us identify further leaders. And I conducted those interviews from 2019 summer through spring of 2020. And then we put together this report that identified really what is inclusive science communication, because this was really a new way to describe this equity-focused approach to science communication. So
if I may, I have one short follow-up question. So of course, for all people watching this video, of course, we'll put the link to the full report below there so you can read all the details there, but maybe it's just a short summary. So what were, for one or two examples, from which areas did you interview people? So what did you all count towards science communication and people engaged in that field?
So we defined science communication very broadly for this project. So science communication was anyone who works to engage or communicate with people about any topic in science, technology, engineering, mathematics, or medicine, with the goal of some kind of new learning or community benefit, basically. So it was a very broad definition that would include people who do bench science and then communicate that with the public, informal science learning, museum spaces, after school education, just a very, very big tent for who was involved. And we tried to make sure that our sample of interviewees, because we only talked to 30 people in the space, was representative of people coming from all of those different sectors.
Great, thanks a lot. So in this whole report, you basically identified 3 main areas, and also people might have already seen it here in this lesson. You compiled the condensed version of your results in a very well-prepared infographic, I would say. Do you want to talk a little bit about these 3 areas and what your key findings were from this research and then the report?
Absolutely. So from our report, we identified these 3 key traits of what makes an approach an inclusive science communication approach. So foundational to all 3 of these 3 key traits is a focus on equity. So the 3 key traits are intentionality, reciprocity, and reflexivity. From the interviews, I found that everybody I interviewed was very intentional in the way that they went about their work. That was something that differentiated an inclusive approach to science communication from science communication more generally. So intentionality is referring to considering who is the audience to whom you're communicating or with whom you're communicating, and how are they defining science, and also being aware of, with that audience identified, what marginalized identities exist in that audience, and how have they been represented in science, or not represented in science historically. So how that might come into your practice in doing communication would be defining who that audience is, and in your communications, considering how those marginalizations, how you can directly call out what those identities might be and make a point to amplify culturally relevant examples, so that you are sure you're really reaching your community, the intended community effectively. For example, if you are trying to communicate to a community where the seasons don't change, for example, using an example of trees that have lost all their leaves in winter might not really relate to them. So it's thinking through things like that. The next key trait is reciprocity. And this refers to being aware of the outputs and the outcomes of your communication, and being sure that the outputs benefit all the actors involved, the people producing the communications and those to whom it's being communicated. And so one way we can think about that to be more inclusive is, if possible, defining what those outputs and outcomes are with that intended audience. And if that's not an approach that's really possible for your work, also when you do communicate it, social media feedback can be a way to see if you're meeting the needs of your communities, and seeing if you can continue to iterate on your communications to make sure you're addressing what needs might come up through that. The third key trait we identified is reflexivity. So this came up in interviews in the ways that participants would say, well, their humility really, and their awareness that sometimes, like, they're always learning, and the need to continually reflect on who they are in the spaces in which they communicate. And so in doing your work, this is reflecting on both your own identity and the identities, again, of that audience, and how those outcomes are affecting yourself and others. And in terms of how we put that into practice, in reading through your final products and your methodologies, all of it, considering reading through that with the lenses of the different audiences and the different perspectives that those people might bring. And across your team, you probably have people who can bring different lenses to it. So making sure that all of those perspectives are considered, to make sure that you're reflecting on how other people might interpret that work. So those are the three key traits that we identified.
If I may, I would have one question regarding the first. This also leading a bit back to the method of your study, the intentionality. You said you interviewed people that are engaged in the field from a heterogeneous background, but they were all already somewhat engaged. And this intentionality also has the prerequisite that people, well, have the intentionality. So obviously the people that are engaged do have that. So what would you say? Obviously people watching our video now have an initial interest, but reaching out to others and motivating them to participate and to get this awareness of the topic. Did you have any experiences, or did your interviewees share anything on reaching out to others to get them on board?
So I think if you're watching this video, then you're already halfway there, right? Because you have the intention of being more inclusive. And so I think when it comes to reaching out to others, I think that we happen to be in a global moment where people are relatively receptive to these ideas. And so I think leading with a goal of making science more accessible to more communities, I think that's how, really with that thought in mind, is how you start to build a practice of being intentional in your communications.
Okay, thanks a lot. But I guess this is not the only challenge that comes up when you want to make this happen. So that's why also this is a major part of your report, addressing all these challenges and hurdles that have to be overcome. Could you say a little bit about that?
Yes, of course. So we also identified some key major challenges for this field. So the interviewees, we were asked, what's going to keep us from making this the path forward? And what we identified were some things that probably won't surprise scientists. The first thing being that scientists largely, and people in other spaces, really like to stick with their community, stick with the disciplines that they know. And a major challenge that comes out of that is we have these silos of approach, of goals, and of language. So we have our jargon that we use in each of our disciplines, and oftentimes we're doing very similar work, or we may have somewhat similar goals, but because we use these distinct terms, it's very hard to communicate with one another. And so a big challenge is finding ways to bridge that. And then another language barrier is that a lot of our science communication work is happening solely in English. So trying to become more multilingual in the way that we approach our communication. We also identified a major challenge in the fact that this term is a term that we decided was the best path forward for talking about this big tent, but not everyone who does inclusive science communication thinks of themselves as doing inclusive science communication. We found that particularly true in museum spaces. A lot of science museum curators didn't think of themselves as science communicators. And so finding ways to make everyone feel like they are a part of this movement in the same way that we have defined them to be a part of this movement, and really do create a more a sense of belonging for more people in this community. Another challenge is the limited diversity among the people who are leading this movement. So we had a lot of trouble creating a balanced gender representation in the leadership. We found that there are a lot of women leading this work across a lot of other intersections of identity, but we found that it was really largely women-led movement. And so there are potential concerns that this is an area that women who are trained as scientists get pushed to, perhaps, or perhaps the movement's not taken as seriously because of patriarchal expectations of whose knowledge matters. That's not to say that there are only women in the leadership of this movement, but that's a challenge we've identified. We also identified that because, again, this is bringing together a lot of different kinds of expertise, there's not formal curricula in how to do a lot of this work. And so there's a need to formalize that and not codify, but put it in writing, really, so that we can all start to build our expertise. And further, we need more institutional support of these kinds of approaches to be truly effective in our engagement at a higher scale than just our individual research teams.
So regarding these challenges, you already mentioned some aspects and ways how to possibly address that. Where do you see the role of institutions or groups, and what are the possibilities that individuals have? Since this video, probably a lot of young scientists are watching that want to do something themselves, and it's really tough waiting for the institutional structures to change before getting active. So you probably need to do something first to get something moving. So do you have any suggestions from the report, or also from the community, where to go first and where to address these issues?
Yeah, so in terms of moving forward in this work, for individuals especially, one thing we can do is look beyond our discipline when we're doing our research, like your literature review. If you're doing work that's around equity, for example, the education space has done a lot of work around culturally responsive pedagogy, and that can very easily bleed into the way that we do our communication for science communication. And so not bounding ourselves to the same journals we always look to, and also looking outside of this peer-reviewed literature and seeing what practitioners can teach us about how we can do better. So that's a really big way to move things forward as individuals, building networks among individuals who have shared interests. Twitter is a very big space for this work, but you absolutely don't have to be on Twitter to be a part of the inclusive science communication community. Other spaces, so because of this launched out of our symposium at the University of Rhode Island, that website has a lot of resources and potential organizations to match up with to keep fostering collaboration, and a lot of conferences increasingly have groups focused around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and those are wonderful spaces to build your networks and potential collaborations. Another big thing that we found in this work is the importance of supporting early career science communicators. So they were another part of our data collection that I didn't mention before. We held a focus group at the Society for the Advancement of Chicanos and Native Americans in the Sciences, SACNAS, where we spoke to young leaders in this movement about what they see as the challenges, and also at the ARIS Symposium, which I will probably not say that acronym correctly, but it's ARIS, to talk about what they see as paths forward. And what we found is really incredible is the way that these early career people, they start from this place of equity. That's just their default. And so we can turn to and support these early career folks and learn from them so that we can really transform all of our science communication. So if you are farther along in your career, appreciate the work of these early career people. While you may have some very valuable life experience, they still do too. So recognizing that experiential knowledge. And then at the institutional level, it's about funding this work, right? And so providing support monetarily really does encourage individuals and labs and practitioner partners to all work together to move from a place of equity in all of their work. And then one final thing that goes to both institutions and individuals is prioritizing evaluation, because we can't know what the best practices are unless we're checking if what we're doing is actually working. And so that's really a thing that we all need to focus on in doing this inclusive work, is making sure that we test whether these practices are doing what we hope that they are.
So for this last, also a very short follow-up question that lies close to my heart as a science communication researcher also. What role do you see for, say, really theoretically funded large-scale evaluations that probably not an individual can do, but require a whole project, whatever, 1 or 2 people doing that over a large time period? And are there also possible, I say that, yeah, evaluation methods or approaches, just thinking about how this whole thing works, or if it works, that an individual could do? Is like, did you have any experiences on that?
So yeah, we've been thinking a lot about what those evaluations can look like. And part of it is a need for, on the funding timelines, expanding the timeline to last longer than just the end of the project, because that's part of the challenge. So doing evaluations that give us some distance from the end of a project to see, say, 6 months or a year out, how do people who were a part of it as scientists or as community members, how has their lives changed, if at all, as a result of that project? So those kinds of evaluations. And then also more democratic and reciprocal approaches to evaluation that ask what the participants thought of the research project itself and the project's design, and the interaction between the researchers and the practitioners. But yeah, so looking into work around democratic evaluation, and I'm missing some of the other terms, but we're thinking a lot about what those other innovative approaches would look like that aren't, surveys are absolutely a valuable way to measure and evaluate, but going beyond that as well and seeing what other longer term measurements we can have.
So following up on the aspect of moving forward, as a last question, so how are you moving forward? So what are you going to address? What are the parts that haven't been addressed in the report and you're working on? You probably, or maybe also would like to have, I don't know, ideas, feedback, comments on, and what would be something you would recommend to young scientists that are watching this video, how they could move on with their work? Any inspiring quotes or first steps that everyone could do? Anything would be appreciated.
So for my own work, because this was a landscape study, we were at a really high level seeing what is the whole scope of this work. And so I'm now trying to narrow in on what is the experience of different specific affinity groups in this inclusive science communication movement, and how can we more radically include them. So that's where my work is right now. In terms of people who are wanting to move into this space, I think a great place to start is building your community of people. You can see what all of the many different ways people are doing this work. And so doing some reading into that. And also just starting by trying to make some kind of new communication, trying something new, because that's really where all of this is coming from. We are all learning from each other as we go. And so I think for young scientists, for new scientists to this movement, it's taking the risk to try something new, and knowing that this is a wonderfully supportive movement where the feedback I find is largely positive, and all feedback is really genuinely given with love and support for wanting to amplify your voices. It's a great space to be an early career person.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for sharing your results, but also sharing your experiences. And as I mentioned, we post some links for the report and some further sources down there, so you can read more. And once again, thanks a lot for joining me here.
Thank you.